Hi, hello everybody. Today we have a very exciting guest with us. And as you all know, the structure of the session is that we're going to have a 45-minute talk and then a 15 minutes Q&A session. So if you guys have any questions, please write in the chat and we will get back to you by the end of the session. So our guest today is Ben Denzer. Ben is an artist, designer, and publisher. He is interested in books, the physicality of images, playing with value, focusing a view, and finding moments of humor. He likes making simple formal moves, collaging, counting, and collecting. And without further ado, I would give the stage to Ben. We are very happy to have you here today with us.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me. Okay, can you see the talk in its form? Okay, let me make it so
Yes.
I can move you guys. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm super excited to be here and to share my work with all of you and share my practice a little bit. Lately, I've been thinking about piles. I think life is a collection of piles that kind of slowly grows. Um, Sorry, I gotta move the zoom thing a little bit. There we go, perfect. Okay, I think life is this collection of piles that slowly grows. And in terms of the things that I make, I kind of have a few piles. So I have a pile of book covers, I have a pile of publication designs, I have a pile of editorial illustrations, a pile of some classes that I teach, artist books, some work that uses physical currency, some photographs that play with printed paper, some things that I count, a book I'm slowly researching and working on writing, and then this 13 plus year collage project that I plan to continue until I die. And so figuring out how to present these piles in a context like this is always a bit of a struggle for me. And so I think really talks and presentations are a way, kind of like an opportunity for me to confront the whole mess of one's practice and to try and pull, some narrative or some meaning from it. But I always find myself wanting to talk about the entire pile, and so I end up talking relatively fast. For a while, I used to introduce myself with this photo of a hat that said books on it, because so much of what I do revolves around books in one way or another. This is a page from a book I made called Four Flip Books. It's a flip book within a flip book within a flip book, flip book within a flip book within a flip book within a flip book. I think I forgot one flip book. This is an inflatable book jacket. You can wrap it around your book and read in the pool or the bath. These are some holes I drilled in books. These are some wheels on books. These are some book covers. I started my kind of career in design at Penguin. In undergrad, I studied architecture, but when I graduated, I got a job designing book covers. These are a few of the book covers I've designed. I also design publications. This is a really tall exhibition catalog for Center for Book Arts. As part of the design here, I fully justified all of the text without hyphenation by changing the point size of each line. This is a magazine called Book Art Review. It's a journal for book art criticism. In the design, I was kind of playing with using a shifting decorative border, so changing how it fills the space to create different layouts for different categories of content. This is a redesign for this publication called The Illuminator, which is this biannual publication put out by the University Club, which is this organization in New York that has this really great library. And so here I was kind of riffing on the guidelines used in medieval illustrated manuscripts. This is a set of pamphlets that acts as a walk through a particular garden. So each booklet is a single path, and the booklets are printed on vellum. So it's like walking through the garden on a misty day. And so you kind of walk from one architectural folly to the next, and kind of things reveal themselves. And then it's kind of this choose your own adventure of the next path. This is a catalog for the Princeton Visual Arts Department. It collects the work from all the seniors who graduated in 2024. And so each student's work in a brief text that they write is kind of presented over a series of spreads. And I designed the book so that all the text is kind of held off to the side. And it's kind of contained in these little tabs that become this running narration, kind of allowing the central part of the book to just be, these images. When designing books, I try, as much as I can to experiment, and it's more fun for me if something can be unusual in some way or have some kind of specific visual decision that gets rigorously followed. And so this is a pile of some of the experiments I did before, settling on the particular shapes for this Princeton book. The book on the left is the one I just showed you from 2024, and the book on the right kind of holds the work from the class of 2025. And so here, I continued the idea of having all the text in tabs, but this past year I put all the tabs on the top of the book. And so we'll see what I'll do next year and where the tab will go. I became a father last year, and in May, my son turned 1. And so this was a book I made just for kind of my wife and me. And it collects images from his first year. So each page is a day. This is May 21st, 2024. This is May 21st, 2025, when he turned 1. And so every page within the book, is a single photo from a single day. And it's crazy, to see how he grows, within the pages. And this kind of, I show you this just because this is why I like books. Books can kind of hold things together, and a whole year can fit, into your hand. This book is a tool that fits in my pocket. I teach college classes, and I'm often, the college classes are often around books and publishing, and I'm really bad at remembering names. So I developed a method of, making a little flashcard zine. So, this book is made from a single sheet of paper, and these flaps hide each student's name so I can practice their names while I'm like on my way to class. And so I make a zine like this for kind of all the classes I teach. I also make lots of book-related editorial illustrations. This was for an article on lip reading in the New York Times Magazine. This was for a list of fall books. Because I'm often hired to make an article, to make an image for an article that relates to books in some way, I get freedom to play with how I make, my images. So I end up experimenting with different mediums. I try one thing, and then I try another. And because all these projects are all related to books, I get to play with the form of the book itself. So I've been pushing and kind of pulling its image as much as I can, seeing how far I can stretch things and what I can make, and kind of trying to push how far I can make something from just this one simple building block. Like, how many things can I make, with a book? And I've also been playing kind of with scale. These are mini books, mini versions of books published by A24, which is this movie publisher, this movie studio. I also have a defunct Instagram account called Ice Cream Books, where, like it sounds, it was this place where I used to post images of ice cream on books. And I made over kind of 300 pairings of books and ice cream over the years. But lately, some of my other piles have been taking up more of my time. But back in its heyday, this project got blurbs of praise from Bella Hadid, and Hal Foster, so cutting across kind of the culture in a weird way. I kind of made it onto the back page of the New York Times book review. And along with kind of designing books, and kind of putting ice cream on them, I also make and publish my own books. I run this small edition press called Catalog Press, where I design and publish books that I mostly bind by hand. Some of the books are catalogs of words. This is a Jorge Luis Borges short story, published here as kind of one word per page, each in a different typeface and risograph printed. This is a book. This book is a single poem by the poet Michael Dickman. And here it's the negative space, the red that's been screen printed with this kind of vibrant rocket red ink onto a light pink paper. Sometimes the books I make are catalogs of objects. This is 20 bound slices of American cheese. This is 15 mass market paperbacks. This is 50 mass market paperbacks. So as you can see, kind of things start to pile up quickly. This is the largest book I've added to my pile. In 2023, I got an MFA from RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. And to graduate, every MFA student has to make a thesis book that goes into the library. And I think the MFA thesis as this, form is kind of a performance of academic accomplishment. And so I wanted to lean into that. And so I made a thesis book that was bigger than the school's library. And so RISD's main library is mostly this large cavernous room that's 180 feet by 114 feet. When fully opened, my thesis book is 200 feet by 125 feet. And so you can see this is 4 people it takes to open the book. There's a dog here that's going to run this way in a second. And so here I really wanted the scale to be the statement. And so when it opens, it just contains the stuff that they make you put in your thesis. So the statement that says this is a thesis presented in partial fulfillment for the degree, and then these, signatures of my advisors all enlarged. So this is all recorded, from a drone, and we got lucky just with the perfect amount of wind, on this day. This is me and my friend Zach standing on the cover. And if you're curious how, I made the book, its pages are composed of kind of 52 10 by 50 foot rolls of white overwintering plastic, which is made for greenhouses. And altogether, the whole book weighs around 800 pounds. And so to make it, I slowly traced the letters, by hand onto each roll of plastic. And so I made the system of registration marks so I could roll the plastic on these tubes. And then I had, so much help filling in all the outlines. So I had kind of a team of friends who helped paint everything in, and then a team of friends who helped kind of construct and kind of put it together on the last day. And so it was this nonstop kind of physical activity for a whole month and a half, and this crazy last day of kind of construction and documentation. And it's definitely the most physically exhausting kind of project I've ever done. But I'm glad I did it. So my time at RISD gave me the kind of prodding to step back and try and make some sense of my whole pile of work, not just the books I was making. So I started kind of thinking about the relationships between all the things in this growing pile of my body of work. And I tried to, find a way to create a narrative from this heap. And so I put together this artist talk in the form of a book. So the talk kind of works this book works as a slide lecture, much like the one I'm giving now, but it's in the form of a book. So it has 816 pages and it's 49 minutes long. And it's organized around a series of statements that build on one another. So this is one of the statements. I believe in a sort of coherentism. Coherentism is a term I learned in an undergrad philosophy class. It's a theory of knowledge that says the justification for beliefs comes from the coherence of a system rather than on truth emanating from any one foundational belief. Basically, it means that things prop each other up, that there is no meaning delivered from on high. It's a web of connections all the way down. I think this relates to the body of work a person makes. I think if you make enough, connections will bubble up. Sometimes these connections are formal. Sometimes content binds things together. Sometimes color or a process or a movement, a sense of humor, a way of treating the frame. But I think if there is enough, things will start to speak to each other. And so that's kind of how I'm trying to treat this, presentation to show a lot of work and process and hoping that there's enough to kind of find, some meaning in it. Lately, I've been making and photographing a lot of printed paper models. And I've been thinking about the piling up of work as a whole in my body of work. And so I've realized that I started making piles, more and more as I'm thinking about this. So these are two images published in the Atlantic magazine back in March of this year. They accompanied a short story by George Saunders. This is how they looked in the magazine. To make these images, I start with photographs. In this case, a photo of a flower I bought at a shop around the corner from my apartment, and a picture of a cubicle that my father sent to me. I take these source photos and I unfold them digitally. So cutting, stretching, and distorting the original images, I kind of create this flat sheet that I can print out. I then cut these printed images and remake the objects in physical space. And I get a reality from this process because there are shadows and textures built into the original photos. And then I rephotograph them, kind of returning these 3D models into a flat, 2D space. And while I like the final images I get from this process, I also really like the process itself. It's often very slapdash. I'm working within the tight time constraints of editorial timelines. And the models that I make often exist just to be kind of lit and photographed. Outside of the frame, they're often kind of very sloppy and haphazard. They're held together by small bits of tape. And I'll show more of this way of making in a moment. But first, I want to show you some collages. Looking back, I kind of see that I've been drawn to the physicality of images on paper for quite a while now. I think this has been because I find some comfort in making things physically. In college, I was given a small studio space and told to, make art. And so I ended up making a bunch of collages. I found myself collaging because I didn't really know what else to do. And I found a lot of solace in the process itself of not really thinking about what I was making, but, rather just letting myself play. Often I would take two printed images and, cut one piece out of one and glue it into the other, usually trying to have it fit in some particular way. And I would move, quickly, making these relatively small, simple, formal moves. Sometimes the images I used were from drastically different sources. Sometimes I took two images from the same old book and combined them. And I like the subtlety I could get with this process. How sometimes you can really kind of tell what images have been collaged into what, and sometimes, you can't. Using physical images, physically cutting and combining them, gave me something to respond to. Each image came with an existing scale and physical quality, a predetermined tone and color. And having these things to push up against was important for me. For me, making is responding to a context, to constraints, to things that came before, to things that exist. Sometimes it's a specific moment, like Andy Warhol using ketchup, or a specific text, like Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence. This is the book in a block of resin held up into a particular page that influenced how I think about things. Sometimes it's responding to an existing object. These are wood blocks printed onto book pages, adding as a way to highlight or emphasize, or to question. The green here is screen printed. But often I find myself responding formally. These are glass bottles whose bottoms have stretched. Here, I've scanned a page and then laser cut a specific wood block to print back onto that same page. So on the left, you see the wood block print on top of the page it's responding to, and on the right, you see that same block printed on a blank sheet. This is an old arms and armor catalog from the Metropolitan Museum. I printed cyan, magenta, and yellow wood blocks back into the pamphlet. I think I like the blocks printed on a blank page more than when they are printed into the original pamphlet, but I needed the original as a way to get me there. None of us work, in a vacuum. We're always entering into conversations with things that already exist. I think design is relationships between people, histories, contexts, and forms, between the things we make and the things that are already in the world. This is something I took from Jason Boer, who was the first art director that I worked with at Penguin. This is a collage he put on my desk the first day I started as a junior designer. When I was at Penguin, every time I was given a cover to design, I felt like I was in over my head. And that feeling has really, never gone away. I have a book cover I'm working on now, and I feel like I've, no idea what to do for it. Um, when I was starting out, I had the luxury of being a full-time in-house employee, so I could either be sad and scared and kind of sit staring at the blank screen in my cubicle, or, I could spend the afternoon carving type into a block of foam, working at the communal table in the office where people would come up and chat. And Penguin was going to pay me, twice a month either way. And so I always found it, more fun for me to spend my time carving the block of foam. And the only problem is that when you try this and then the editors like this idea, but they want you to change the typeface, then, you have to get another block of foam and you have to try, something else. And I tried this foam thing a few times. I really like seeing how far a single process can take me. I really enjoy playing with anything that gets me making in the physical world. And I think that I get things from it too. I think it's easier for me to make compelling things physically. These images have a feeling of depth because they really, do have depth. They're photographs of 3D constructions. I wanted this cover to feel like it was behind bubble wrap, so I got bubble wrap and put it over some printed type. I could try and model water on the computer, or I could just get, some water. When you make something physically, you get real shadows, you get real edges, real fingerprints, you get real biological decay, and you don't have to work so hard to make things feel real because they are real. Sometimes it just takes a lot of balloons to get the perfect pop. All this being said, it's not like I don't use a computer. It's just that I don't use a computer in isolation. I'm often projecting something, or printing things out and layering them, playing with light, letting paper curve and fall, kind of letting shadows hit it in different ways, bending it into itself, rolling paper, layering it, putting it on a scanner, moving it closer and further from the glass, stacking printouts between plexiglass sheets, layering and photographing them on a light box. Here, the paper sheets overlap just slightly on different levels of plexiglass. And you get this almost stained glass quality with the light behind shining through, giving it kind of a glowing or a porcelain look. And so the way I make these is really important to me. And this process of making is kind of how I like to think about the word craft. I think craft is feeling a process, a felt intentionality, a clarity of relationships, a presence of some humanity. This is what I like so much about my printed paper models. The way I make them gets contained in the final image, and the paper is always revealing itself. Sometimes this is through its sheen, the way it shines when bent from certain angles, or its visible cuts and thicknesses. And because these objects are so small, there's a texture that comes from the printed CMYK dots. And there's a tension between what is actually dimensional, and what is a printed image. And I think these imperfections kind of give the images something. I think they gain something by being imperfect and real. And I like that we kind of feel their frailty a little bit. So for the most part, these are all commercial projects. Um, when I'm hired to make an editorial illustration, I pitch many different ideas. One is selected, and then I make it, and it ultimately gets published. And so for each image, there's a particular meaning the image is meant to convey. But the meaning I take comes more from the process, from my way of making these things, and from what I like to think of as, the craft. Because of the particularities of this way of working, where I need to, start with images, I've also used these projects as ways to collaborate, as ways to share credit. So my dad sent me these photos of boxes. I like having our name, together there in the paper. And I've been doing this as much as I can on book covers too. This is my mom's handwriting. My wife Lily cut these flames. After a few tries, I finally got my father-in-law's photo of a solar eclipse onto a cover. This is Austin's countertop, Dylan's rolling pin, and a clock that Eric Lee saw. This is Kaya's shoe. These are Lily's binoculars. This is a house my Uncle Pete built. As the images I make in this way pile up, I think they become less tethered to their original contexts and more connected to each other. I think I get something from the quantity of them. I think with quantity, there's less to explain because more is plainly apparent. Rather than being told what to pay attention to, an understanding of intentionality comes from seeing what relationships are held consistent. So I think this piling up is a key part of my work. In college, I kept making those collages I was showing you until I had, 500 or so. I think these type of piles build up naturally over time by just continuing to push at a process. So this is Sharpie on Goya bean cans. It obscures some of the packaging, while leaving some other elements visible. This is Sharpie on some old family photos. I was going through some old boxes with my parents one day, and we found these printed images. I just started kind of playing with them. I think this was my second grade classroom. This is Sharpie on a book of comparative photographs. So something I found in the basement of a bookstore. And these are my hands, acting as frames. They do something different than the Sharpie, but I think a similar thing, to the Sharpie on the Goya bean cans. These are my friend David's hands. This is my wife Lily. Recently, I've been building up a new but related pile of work, playing with physical money as something to respond to. So these are all US dollar bills. This is embroidery on a $2 bill. This is embroidery on a $1 bill. And like with the Sharpie and with the hands, I'm leaving some bits of the original object visible. This is screen printing, printing two-color grids onto bills. Screen printing goes a lot faster than embroidery. This is Abe Lincoln on the $5 bill, and these are his eyes. This is UV printing on US coins. At RISD, I had access to a UV printer, and I really loved playing with it. It took a while to get the system of alignment working just right, but ultimately I figured out how to print, where I wanted on these coins. And so in all these projects I've shown you, I think there's a power also to limiting the number of formal moves that I'm making. I think I get something from the legibility. And I also think I get something from commitment and rigor. that as these simple formal moves pile up within a series and across bodies of related work, that they reinforce and they buoy each other. I think I get a certain depth from these decisions playing out, at this scale. But also at the same time, I think there's a depth to looking closely at each individual thing. So this is the back of a coin called the dime in the United States. And so I think in responding to what's there, I think you can make something new. So now this says Ted ate a dime. And I think meanings can change, and you can kind of find things that might be unexpected. These are US dimes on a traffic island. These are US nickels in a bathroom. This was part of a series of coin installations in semi-public spaces. These are nickels knotted together to create a textile. This is paper with nickels embedded within the fibers. This sheet has $65.30 worth of US dimes. One of the reasons I like working with physical currency is because people are familiar with it. People know what money, looks like. They're often familiar with its color and with its various imagery. And so this lets me play a little bit. These are quarters I modified, and they all have titles that relate to different economic terms like inflation Q2, Q1, Q2, and Q4, and double declining balance depreciation. And I like books for the same reason. People are familiar with them and they have expectations around what a book is. They also have bookshelves and tables. Money has a very understandable value and a very visible value. And so this book is titled 222 $2 bills. And so you immediately know how much the material costs, were to make this book. This is a set of books that each contains 192 $1 bills. This was an edition of 192 books that came in 8 different colors. And I sold these at the Whitney Museum gift shop for twice their face value. So when people bought them, they knew they were at least getting half of what they paid for. This is a book of 77 Lucky Sevens, which are a scratch-off lottery ticket from New York State. So this book is potentially worth over $200,000 if each one of these is, the big winner. And so when I sell books, I like to have their price related to their contents in some way. So I sold this book titled Five Ketchups for $10 per Heinz packet. And how I price work impacts its potential audience. And it often takes me a long time to make most of my work, and I don't make that much of it. But I don't only want the things I make to sit in wealthy people's homes. And so I try and sell things across a range of prices. And I've come to view libraries as an ideal audience. They're spaces where the books I make can live in a context with others and they can be seen and used. They're places of public access, places there where they might be part of a conversation. This is my book, 20 Slices of American Cheese in a Mini Fridge in Oxford University. And so all these books I make and publish as catalog press are really just an outlet for me to explore visual and formal ideas. And so the press kind of becomes this container for these various experiments. This book holds 2,000 photos of architectural details that I took on my phone kind of over the 5 or so years before I made the book. They're all sorted according to type of detail. This is one roll of Charmin Ultra Strong toilet paper. Sometimes an idea for a book comes from a commercial project. This one is titled Stamp Compositions, and it has 3,000 stamp compositions within it. And the idea came while I was working, on a book cover, trying to use stamps in a graphic way. And I took some found stamps that I thought were visually interesting, and I removed their text and image contents because I didn't want their specific words and images to be on the cover of this book I was designing. And ultimately, this direction, didn't pan out, but I kept this kind of printout of stamps on my wall and kind of kept looking at it and really liked it. And I started collecting more and more stamps and scanning the ones with interesting compositions, removing their images and text contents so I could just focus on their graphic shapes, and then sorting them according to their formal qualities. And once I had 3,000, I collected and bound them together as this book. And I really like that my commercial and personal practices are a bit porous, that I'm often hired to make a book or money related image. And I kind of like how this adds to the bodies of work I'm exploring. I think that the context of my personal work, kind of gives these commercial images a little bit of an additional depth and meaning. And I think the more that I make, the more, these connections, end up piling up. And so even when I make something for someone else, the way I make it and the process behind it kind of lets me blur the lines a little bit. So my sister sent me these photos of dandelions that I used to make this image for the Wall Street Journal. And for me, the final image has more depth because of kind of where these images came from. This is a short film I made documenting objects from my dad's office. I had him take photos of things in his space and send them to me. And then I unfolded them to make these miniature, models. And so these are each letter-sized sheets of paper. Um, and I really kind of, for me, these personal projects are really, really generative. And it all kind of builds one small thing at a time. And so again, when making something for someone else, kind of, the meaning is kind of baked into the assignment. But when, I make work for myself, it's often not as straightforward. And in a way, I think working as a designer and a book cover designer specifically has made me realize how flexible meaning is. As a book cover designer, I used to get kind of sad when a cover I was excited about got killed. And it's what we call it when your book cover doesn't work out. So I used to get sad when the things I designed got killed and never made it out into the real world. But now I just keep these designs around and in my mind, knowing that I might, find a way to reuse them in the future. So I really liked this idea, and I thought it worked, perfectly quite a few times. But I haven't had any luck with this yet. But someday I know I'll get something, like this approved. I think reusing things, and more importantly, knowing that I could reuse them, allows me to see everything as useful. It's a way of working that means nothing is a waste. It's all just experiments that either work out or get added to this pile that I can pull from. So every book is unique, but abstractions and visual effects are stretchy. And meaning changes depending on audience, context, and time, depending on what is around what. I think the slipperiness I found in design has shaped how I think about meaning in all the things I make. These are spreads from a book I made called 2,222 Accidental Vanity Plates. They're license plates from the States that say things that I don't think their owners paid for them to say. So they're license plates that have meanings that have shifted over time. I think all meaning works like this. It changes, it shifts. It depends on the person looking and the context they put it in. I think this is why I put more weight on form and craft, on quantity and scale. I think these things are more immediate and more durable than spending too much time trying to constrain the meaning or the reading of a particular project. I think more comes from the legibility of simple moves. This is 6,000 Dandelions. It's a book of 6,000 pressed and dried dandelions laminated between plastic sheets. Without knowing the book's context, I think you feel its scale and its contained time. But if I tell you these dandelions were picked from Mount Auburn Cemetery during the brief few weeks when they bloom before turning to seeds and blowing away, and if I tell you I finished the book right around the 600,000 COVID death mark in the US, I think more meanings latch onto the object. While these meanings are important, I think they're also extra to a certain extent. I think you feel something without them because of the quantity of the dandelions, because of the bigness of the object, because of the large roundness of the number. 6,000 dandelions, row after row. So I think something really powerful comes from repetition. This is one of my favorite poems. It's titled Lewis and Clark Overheard in Conversation by James Tate. And Lewis and Clark were the kind of people tasked with exploring, the West when the Louisiana Purchase happened in the United States. And so this poem is just this single line, then we'll get us some wine and spare ribs, repeated 23 times. And so I published it here as a book with every word on its own spread. And this is the poem as it's typically seen on a single page. I think this feeling of repetition piling up is an important part of my work. This is a series of photographs where I physically piled photographs onto portrait sitters. So working in the space with an office printer, I would take a photo and then immediately print out sections of the same photo at life size, putting that image back onto the portrait sitter, and then continuing to build up, this process. And I really like how a sense of time gets layered, in this. And I kind of kept playing with this way of making images, trying to push the process with each iteration and see kind of how far I could take it. Trying to layer things as much as possible to kind of create and collapse depth and time a little bit. And as I make things, I think one image eventually leads to the next, but it's often not a direct, path. Again, I think if you have enough, you can start to kind of see connections. And again, this is one of the main reasons why I like books. Books are these dense piles in these compressed packages. They can hold a lot, and they're also able to both kind of contain and to focus. This is a book I made called 400 People from Detroit. It takes Diego Rivera's Detroit industry murals, these four walls densely populated with people, and it presents almost all of the figures individually. So each person as large as they can be on the page. The entire mural read person by person, all contained in this one bound object. And so you get to experience the depth and the density of this mural, but in, this different way. This book is 129 die. Each page is a sensational newspaper headline reporting a tragedy. So this is page 14, page 15, page 16, page 17, page 119, 120, 121, 122. This is a book that holds all the known information about individuals whose cells, like their cells from their body, have been immortalized through their use in scientific research. You may know the ethically complicated story of Henrietta Lacks, but there are so many, more people who now have pieces of themselves kind of living on in this way. This is 234 acknowledgments, where I scan the acknowledgement pages from books that won the Pulitzer Prize, this big kind of literary award, and then arrange them by award year. So these are texts that a certain part of society has deemed the best. And then the acknowledgement pages are where each of these authors, lays bare their networks that led these books into being. And so I think there's something to seeing them all together. I think, cataloging can be this way of noticing and focusing a view. Recently, I've been playing with ways of cataloging outside of bound books as well. So this is a project titled Brown University, had 28,290 windows. And so the project is 207 3 by 1 inch plaques on buildings. And so in 2022, I counted the number of windows on each building that Brown University owns in Providence, Rhode Island. And I think you can collect something by counting it, by, making a record. And so if you walk around Brown's campus, you'll find these tucked away on each building. And I like that they're each one simple kind of dry statement. How as a collection they're a little bit absurd, but I like how they kind of point towards something to be noticed. How they might get you thinking about the fact that Brown University owns a lot of windows and how they're a bit of a prod to start looking at the buildings. Last January, I spent a weekend at the RISD Art Museum, and I went from room to room with this cart. And I was counting the number of visible depictions of human noses within each artwork currently on display in the museum. So there were two noses in this room, and they belonged to these two sculptures. And these are all the signs I left in each of the museum's 48 rooms. And in total, this day I counted all of the noses, and there were 2,732 noses in total. And so the performance was temporary, and these signs were only up for a weekend, but the project, lives on in these images. And I think no matter what I make, everything, eventually gets turned into an image. These are Birkin bags made out of asparagus and cucumbers, cabbage and apples. All physical objects change and decay over time. Usually books outlive people, but my 20 Slices of American Cheese book kind of flips that relationship. A few libraries have purchased the book, and while individually wrapped craft American singles are fairly shelf stable, people can bring their bacteria and mold to them, and so the book kind of acts as a petri dish. This copy at NYU has recently been refreshed. The conservators removed the moldy slices and they replaced them with fresh cheese that they bought from the same grocery store where I bought the original cheese. But different libraries are taking different approaches, and some are letting kind of nature take its course and letting it kind of mold and change. The cheese book led to this book titled 20 Slices of Meat. This is made out of mortadella, kind of cover and all. And I made this during a short residency at the University of Michigan's Book Art Studio. And the meat is from Zingerman's, this famous deli there. And, mortadella has kind of fat and pistachios within it. And so I use pieces of fat to inlay the cover type. And this was the first, project I've made where I could just work through lunch and eat all my scraps. And this is definitely the most edible book I've ever produced. But now it really exists, only in these images. And so I believe, things mostly live in pictures. I think documentation is as important as the work itself. And I know this may seem, opposed to my embrace of the real and the physical, but I see it as an acknowledgement of how our world works. More people will see the images of my work than the real things. And I think these images will outlive, the objects. I find myself thinking a lot about how, things exist within images and how images can be a way to hold on to objects, experiences, and time. Back in August of this year, I was in Canada giving a talk and tabling at the Halifax Art Book Fair. And wanting to preserve this experience while I was experiencing it, I kind of made a miniature version of the fair as it was happening. So I had a printer at my table and I went around and took photos of people's books and booths. And then, like I was showing you earlier with my editorial illustrations, I kind of stitched these photos together from different angles. And then printing them out on my table's small printer, I was able to kind of cut, fold, and kind of glue them together. And I ran out of time, but I tried to capture, a table or a book from most of the exhibitors, who were at the fair. And it was this fun way to record and to make at the same time. And it made, kind of me look closely at the things at the fair. And it let me kind of hold on to the experience, after it was over. And so I called the project a small Canadian book fair because that's what it was. So I like the way images, can preserve their contents. And this is mostly how I use pictures personally. I photograph things I want to remember on my phone. Since 2011, I've been uploading an image and a quote for each day onto a website. It started as a Tumblr blog, but has turned into something else. So I take all the photos and screenshots I've made on a particular day and collage them together into a single image. The project lives on this site that Eric Lee helped me build, and you can look at them day by day or month by month. You can search and sort. This is every day I've been in Providence, Rhode Island. These are images I've tagged with spiral. And I know this is a bit obsessive, but I think I get things from it. It's become a way for me to record, a way for me to hold on to what I see and hear, a way of collecting my references together. And maybe most of all, it's become a way for me to use these things, a way for me to make something from and with them. For me, I think it's this making that's the most important thing. And I think it's this making to a certain extent that also makes me. I mean this in a straightforward way, where if you make book covers, people think of you as a book cover designer. If you make illustrations, people call you an illustrator. But I think it's also more encompassing than that. I think what and how you make is what you pay attention to, what you spend your time on. And I think that to a large extent is what makes a person. I think people are aggregates and piles. This project is me as a pile of images and a pile of words. I think about the project as this digital book of sorts. It's a book that grows, page by page, day by day, month by month, and, ultimately year by year. This is November, 17th of last year in 2024. Here, my parents were visiting. This is the year before in 2023. I was at a movie in 2022, back when I lived in Boston. This is 2020, and on backwards. And so the project has become this way of me remembering things. But thinking about the project after all my years of making it, I don't think I really make these images and post them on the web because I have a desire, for people to see them necessarily. It's more that I want the project to exist in the world. And for that to happen, I feel like it needs to be able to be seen, that it needs to be kind of published in some way. And I think this is why I like books in general. Books exist in the world. They're there to be opened if you want, um, but you don't have to open them. And, I'm kind of sharing this with you here at the end because this project is my largest pile. It's my pile of all my other piles. And it's this pile that I plan on continuing kind of to pile up until I die. And so that's it for me. Thanks again, for listening. Excited to chat and answer your questions. So I'm gonna stop sharing so I can see you guys better.
Thank you so much, Ben. It was really inspiring. I'm pretty excited to hear from you. I have some questions. I would also invite the audience, if they have also their questions, please write in the chat. Um, so something that I picked up from your talk is that you put a lot of value in the process. But I want to ask, like, how do you come up with a process from the scratch? I think like that's something that we as students really struggle with.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's not like one day I sit down, I think I have to come up with a new process. It's kind of things um, kind of one thing leads to the next sometimes. So for example, I make a lot of those illustrations using printed paper now. And I kind of came to that process initially from an assignment that I had where I, was making an editorial illustration for this particular article, and I pitched the idea of having a desk that gets crumpled up. And so to execute that, I was like, how would I do that? Maybe I make a desk out of paper and I could crumple it up. And then I realized, oh, I really love, you know, I like the effect of this printed paper desk. And so then I, use that process to make my dad's office as a personal project. And then it led to this other thing. So sometimes it's kind of, I like to think of just like trying a bunch of different things. And then only through trying stuff and making stuff can you realize, oh, that's useful or that's fun to do or that can lead to interesting places. So it's kind of a continual process, a meta process of trying to never just do one process, to try and keep experimenting so you can see kind of what might work or be exciting.
Yeah, I think when I see you, it's pretty obvious that you're enjoying what you're doing. Like it feels like you don't need a reason to start creating. But I feel like we here, like normally I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about a project that I want to do. I have a lot of, motivation when I think about the idea. But then when I start, getting my hands busy, then I just like feel like maybe it's not gonna worth it. Maybe it's not gonna be, good enough. How do you keep motivating yourself throughout the projects, specifically when you don't have a client or this is something that you're doing for yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And um, I think for me, it's kind of like what I was saying about the book covers, where you can always reuse it. And it's kind of like I try and just trick myself into thinking that, even if this doesn't work out for this one thing or it's not as good as I hoped, I can just kind of put it on my shelf or put it in this digital folder or put it in a pile, where then maybe the right thing will come up that I'll need that process for. So um, sometimes it's just thinking like, even if this doesn't work out for now, maybe I'll revisit it later and it'll be, useful for me then. And I also try and think about, I don't know if you all know, there's this educator and screen printer named Karita Kent, and she made this list called Rules for Students and Teachers, and it's really kind of useful when you're a student, but also useful just in general. And there's a few rules that are great, but one is like consider everything an experiment. And so if you consider everything an experiment, there's no win and there's no fail, and there's just it kind of frees you up from the stress of this has to be the best thing I've ever made. This can just be this one experiment. If it doesn't work out, that's fine. It was an experiment, and I either learned something from it or I kind of put it in a pile I can return to later.
That's a really good response. I hope that will like really change the way that I look at my projects. We have a question from Claire. She asked, "Did you ever struggle with finding your niche leading to a career when you started as a working designer? Did you find yourself settling for jobs just to get experience, or did you only look for exactly what you wanted?"
Yeah. Um, a little bit of both. Like, so when I studied architecture in undergrad, and then, along the way took a graphic design class and realized that being book cover designer was a job, and I was lucky that I kind of got an internship in the book cover design world. But then when I was actually graduating, um, there weren't really any book cover design jobs that I really, really wanted. Like there were some at publishers where it didn't seem like I'd have as much freedom or be able to make as interesting books. And so it was this question of like, should I settle and just apply for one of those jobs, or what should I do? I didn't really want to settle at the time. And so I thought, what else would I enjoy doing? And I was studying architecture and I really liked making models, with my hands. And so I found a few architecture model making companies, and I applied to those instead. And I lined up a job at an architecture model making company, so where I'd be like, building a little model of a high rise that some developer is making. And I was about to start that, but then kind of a month or two before I was going to start that, I got an email from someone I was working with as an intern, and they were saying, "Oh, there's this new, junior designer book cover job opening up." And so then I applied and got that job at Penguin. And I mentioned this just to say that I, wasn't a little bit of both. Like I wasn't going to settle for a job I really didn't want to do, and I kind of tried to find some other job, but I also kind of knew that no matter what happens, I was going to be okay. Like I kind of had plan A and plan B and plan C. Um, and I think, if I would never have gotten the email about the job at Penguin, I would, be making models, and I would probably find my own way to, have a fun, creative life, doing that. And so I think being open and realizing that, you can kind of make things work for you no matter kind of where you are is also kind of useful. I see this next question kind of, works in that. Did you set up self-initiated briefs or design challenges for yourself? Um, that's definitely what I did because especially because I didn't study, graphic design, and I was trying to get a job at as a book publisher. So I kind of had to kind of quickly make a book portfolio because I think something that's true is that people, are more likely to hire you if they've seen that you can already do the thing that they're trying to hire you to do. So, before I applied for book cover design jobs, I made a bunch of fake book covers and kind of made my own self-initiated briefs of, here's some books I'm reading, here's some famous books, let me turn them into book covers. And I tried to do that however I could. So I had those collages I made. So I took some of those collages and tried to put type on them, and just tried to kind of, like you're saying, make some self-initiated, briefs. And yeah, so those were kind of scenarios and goals, with the goal of kind of making a portfolio saying, hey, look, I am interested in book cover design, and here I'm starting to kind of design them.
A lot of questions coming in naturally. So I would, yeah, I would probably just to keep it a little bit more short. So we had a question asking from Kimia, how do you balance between staying true to your creative ideas and meeting the client's need and wishes? And then I'm gonna try to
Totally,
merge the
totally.
questions
Um,
together.
yeah. Um, and I think, I have been kind of lucky in my career trajectory where I've been doing like as a book cover designer and as an editorial illustrator, I get a lot of freedom over the things I do, so I pitch a lot of ideas and they can get shot down and killed, but ultimately the ones that make it through, I have a lot of ownership over. So I feel lucky that, I do get a lot of ways to put kind of myself into the projects. But sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes the client chooses the most boring, book cover, or the one that's not exciting, or the sketch that I'm not excited about for an editorial illustration. And so, in those cases, maybe I'm like sad and, I just keep those good ideas around for the next project. And maybe I try and spend less time, on those projects because like I'm less excited about them myself. But another way I kind of deal with that is trying to have my own, projects on the side too, like that ice cream books project, and the catalog press books project I started those all when I was at Penguin, and they were a way for me to have my own project that I had complete ownership over and no one was kind of telling me what to do on. And then they just became the space where I could kind of freely explore. And so if I was kind of creatively frustrated at my day job, I could, have my creative freedom in my personal projects.
Perfect. So another question is about like time management because it seems like your projects are pretty time consuming. So how do you really go from like idea to doing, and how much time would you invest in a project before you know that it is actually something going somewhere that you want it to go?
Yeah. And so I think a lot of, I kind of think about it as like I procrastinate a lot, but I think of it as productive procrastination because I kind of have multiple pots on the stove of things I do right now. So right now I work freelance, and so I have like a book cover I need to work on. I have a few editorial illustrations. I've got some personal things I want to work on. I've got a class I teach on Fridays. And so, I like doing all these things because when I'm stuck on the book cover, I like rather than just staring at it and being stuck, I can work on my editorial illustration or I can work on my personal project. And so my time is still spent productively, but I am still procrastinating. And eventually, maybe I'll get a good idea from one thing by working on the other thing. So it's kind of a balance of that. And I think you also asked, what I like listening to books on tape, like audiobooks a lot. I like, sometimes a project you can have a TV on or a podcast or something. So I kind of consume stuff that way too.
It seems like every place that you put yourself in, a book is kind of involved, like listening to books, looking at books, making books.
Totally, totally.
Yeah, so we have a question asking, how do you hope people feel when they encounter your work for the first time?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I hope they like it. But I don't like spend too much time stressing about how people are going to feel about things necessarily. Like, I think I can't control how people feel about the work. And so, and I know people are going to feel all different things. So I just kind of, it's not a thing that I worry or think about that much. But I think in a lot of my work, like for it to be accessible. Like, I like for it to be approachable. Like ideally a thing you can like kind of get it right away, but also if you look at it closer, you get something more. So I guess that's ideally what I hope people kind of take
Yeah,
from
I
it.
can, like from my experience when I was looking at the images of your works, the book with the dandelion, like it was a completely different, it was a really happy book for me when I was looking
Yeah,
at it. But when you were, explaining what was the story behind it, I was thinking to myself, like the first time that I encountered it was completely springtime, something fascinating that I'm just like, encountering.
yeah,
So it definitely changes when you have the perspective of the artist coming into action.
totally.
So how do you normally deal with comparing yourself to competitors?
Yeah. I guess I don't think about it as like competitors really. I think there's enough space in the world for everyone to do things. I mean, I think it's definitely like I understand what you're saying. Like I'm definitely like scrolling Instagram and being like, oh wow, this designer's making amazing stuff. Like I wish I could have thought of that, or how does she produce all of this stuff? Um, I think everyone has a little bit of like creative jealousy is what you're kind of describing, but um I think I just, there's nothing that really doesn't really get you anything. So I think I just try and make stuff, that I'm interested in and think about it less as like a comparison, as more of just, I'm making this stuff, they're making that stuff. I can learn from them and it's great.
I think something that always happens to me is that there are artists or designers that I look at their work and I think to myself, I want to recreate what they do just because it seems like
Mm,
me in some sense. That's
yeah.
like where I know that I'm kind of maybe envious of them. And then
Mhm.
like that, comes with like this sense of, okay, maybe I can get engaged with their work in a different manner. Do you have any artists or designers that you have, that you had that, emotion towards?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of, like, there's too many. I feel like if I list, I'm gonna like forget someone, but it depends on the discipline too. Like there's like book designers that I really love. There's like artists who I really love. There's painters who I really love. So I think I think also just like the more you can look in the bigger the pile of people you like is, the kind of better.
Yeah, like I wanted to basically see if one name would pop up and be like, yeah, this is, but it's okay. I mean, obviously, this is
It's always just like the last person I saw, and like I was showing with the book of student names, I'm so bad with remembering names that like I never want to say a name because it's always not the real name. It's just the first name that came in my head because I saw it before,
totally
and then
understand.
afterwards I'm like, why did I say that name when I should have said this other name? Yeah, sorry, disappoint.
Yeah, we have a question about coherentism.
Yeah.
Do you create designs with plans of having them fit in a large body of work, or do you just find motifs and fit them all together?
It's a little bit of both. So sometimes like I'm doing things and I realize like, oh, it's all about books, or there's a few things I've done with money and those are kind of related. Um, and so sometimes it's kind of finding those moments. Like I made the dandelion book and I also had a dandelion in illustration and, a few things like that. But sometimes it's also the opposite, the other way where I'll think, hey, I've done a lot of stuff with money and maybe this is a place I can do something with money that can kind of add to that body of work. So it's kind of always doing both, kind of being aware and naturally kind of seeing what's similar and then liking some of those motifs and trying to push my work towards, those directions when I can.
I don't know if I'm like imagining this correctly, or I th like maybe it's not something that you really, engage with. But like this tension between object subject is something that I see like, as a repetitive kind of thing that comes up in different works. For example, with the money, so you have like, both the subjective aspect of it being like the actual money with the same value,
Mhm.
but also like playing with it in a different, kind of like more formal manner. Do you like engage with, topics like philosophical topics or something like that when you are thinking about like, a process, like creating a process? Or is that something that you just, maybe think about afterwards and be like, yeah, that's kind of clicked?
I think a little of both. I think, it's like I think we're probably all probably always thinking about different ways of seeing the world and different examples of things. And so sometimes it's very specific, like what you're saying. Like definitely part of the reason I like playing with money is because it brings up all of these thoughts and questions around value. Um, but sometimes it does come secondary, like when I like the cheese book kind of has become this thing that I think about in terms of like the lifespan of a book and also like what is a book and stuff. But at the time when I made it, I was thinking about what's a quick way I can make a book. Like it takes a lot of time to lay out text on pages, like what's already pages. And I was in a grocery store and I was like, oh, look, cheese, it's pages. So it kind of came from just the goofiness of that moment, but then obviously it does have all this other kind of baggage and ideas with it. So it's kind of an always like a yes and response to that question, I think.
Okay, with that, I think we came to a good conclusion. Thank you so much for your time. It was a really enjoyable talk and a really enjoyable chat with you. I hope we get to see more of you, and thank you everyone for tuning in as well.
Yes.
Um,
Thanks, everybody.
so yeah, without I hope that we see more of you in the academy as well. So thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Yep. Thanks so much. Hope
Thank
to see
you.
you all in person sometime.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.